Okay, so hi everybody. Welcome to the third and final day of the online conference Philosophy and Generative Grammar 2. It is my pleasure to introduce now the first speaker of the day, Professor Friederike Moltmann from the CNRS. Her talk is titled Linguistic and Philosophical Intuitions and the Core-Periphery Distinction. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so the talk has several aims. So I want to talk about notions of intuitions in philosophy and linguistics. And in fact, I want to argue that they are not just similar, but to an extent, they coincide. In fact, they should be viewed as identical to an extent. So I also want to talk about, in general, about philosophical notions or sort of philosophical domains that are implicit in natural language, and in particular, like the domain of ontology or metaphysics that's implicit in natural language, that is natural language ontology. And then I want to make an important distinction, namely I want to draw a distinction between core and periphery. That's a distinction that is essential, on my view, for natural language ontology, but also other philosophical domains that are implicit in natural language. And then the main point will be that linguistic and philosophical intuitions are, in fact, identical when it comes to the core of language. So they're like linguistically reflected intuitions, and when they pertain to the core of language, then they, as philosophical intuitions, are in fact identical to linguistic intuitions. And neither the linguistic nor the philosophical intuitions should be viewed as acceptance in some sense, or in particular belief, but rather they have a different status. So in linguistic intuitions are, in fact, of course, in some sense, knowledge. And the relevant philosophical intuitions should also be viewed as something different than philosophical beliefs or so. Rather, they are, in a sense, on a par with knowledge as well. Okay, so let me talk about intuitions in philosophy and linguistics and the connection between the two. So the notion of a philosophical intuition. So philosophical intuitions concern philosophically relevant propositions or notions. So there are various sorts of philosophical intuitions that play a role in philosophy in different areas of philosophy. So, for example, the issue of whether knowledge is justified through belief, philosophers appeal to particular intuitions, to particular circumstances, and so to in fact argue against that. Philosophers have also argued against for the possibility of mental activity being pursued without particular physical organs on the basis of intuitions. Then there are intuitions about what is morally wrong. There are intuitions about what is essential, and there are intuitions about ontological dependence. For example, the intuition that the singleton of Socrates depends on Socrates, but not vice versa. Socrates doesn't depend on the singleton of Socrates. Yeah, so intuitions seem to play quite an important role in philosophy. Now, what are intuitions? One might, of course, think intuitions are just beliefs of a certain kind, but that is generally considered problematic. So for having an intuition that P, it appears that it is neither necessary nor sufficient to believe that P. So this is something that one finds, for example, in the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on intuitions. So, for example, when one has a sort of visual illusion and one knows that it's a sort of illusion, still one has an intuition, but one won't have the corresponding belief. So the alternative view that has been put forward is that intuitions are sort of seemings. They are on a par with perceptual states. And then also a third view has been defended in me, that intuitions are sort of intuitings. They are just a sui generis attitude. And then intuitions are, as I said, play an important role in philosophy. In fact, they have been considered evidence in philosophy. So they act as premises in philosophical arguments. And that even though they may not come easily and quickly, so I'll talk about that a bit later. So one can also ask a question, so what kind of thing is an intuition? And that's actually quite interesting as regards my recent work on propositional attitudes. So intuitions are not just propositions, but rather they are contents that come with some sort of attitude. Well, the attitude of intuiting or whatever an intuition is supposed to be. And then it seems to me one can actually have an intuition that intuitions, well, they can be strong or good. But one can also say an intuition is correct, and not just in the sense that the intuition, the content of the intuition is true, but also that the intuition is a real intuition. So when I feel like there's an intuition that so-and-so, I can sort of confirm that and really uncover that intuition, and then come to the conclusion, yeah, well, that intuition is in fact correct. And that is a sort of correctness, the correctness of certain attitudes, of making a particular demand or something like that. So that would be support for a view on which intuitions are what I, in my other work, call attitudinal objects. So they are not just pure contents, pure propositions, but rather they are contents that come with some sort of attitude, and then they have particular satisfaction conditions or correctness conditions. So this was just a side remark regarding the ontology of intuitions. And that's another reason why I find intuitions interesting, because there is this connection. Yeah, so now we can go on the second page. Yeah, now intuitions are also a subject of controversy. So especially in recent philosophical discussions. So some philosophers, in particular Kaplan and Max Deutsch, have argued that intuitions do not really play a role as evidence in philosophy. So philosophers actually care more about philosophical disputes and so than intuitions. But I will just set that view aside. So I do think intuitions are quite important, and that's also because intuitions can be linguistically reflected, and in fact, often philosophers appeal to linguistic data in order to uncover philosophical intuitions. So there's a close connection between certain philosophical intuitions and language. And of course, then there are also linguistic intuitions. And the question is, of course, what the connection is between the two. Now, given that intuitions are not beliefs, one may think, well, perhaps they are just knowledge. But in fact, intuitions need not be factive. So in experimental philosophy, intuitions have also become now a subject matter of research. And it has been argued that intuitions may display interpersonal or intercultural inconsistencies. So intuitions are not automatically true. And now a general fact about philosophical intuitions, now I come back to an earlier remark, is that they are not easy and immediate, but may require work. So carefully constructed thought experiments, for example. And one can see this in philosophy all the time, that thought experiments are set up in particular ways in order to bring out intuitions. So intuitions are not immediately given. So that's a myth that philosophical intuitions are immediate and easy. So they require work. Now, what about intuitions in linguistics? So intuitions in linguistics are mainly intuitions about the grammaticality and the semantic acceptability of sentences or constructions. And then linguistic intuitions come in degrees. And that is maybe true for philosophical intuitions as well. And then one can also say that linguistic intuitions are not easy and immediate. So I think working linguists know that. So one often has to really sharpen one's own ears in order to have a feel for a linguistic intuition. One can also say that in the development of a given linguist, there's a development of fine-tuning for linguistic intuitions taking place. And then also in the development of linguistics, into the ear for linguistic intuitions has sharpened. So initially, linguists didn't make a distinction between what is sharply ungrammatical and what is somewhat ungrammatical. But today, various degrees of grammaticality and also unacceptability are generally distinguished. And yeah, so in that respect, we have also a kind of parallel. And now there are philosophical intuitions that are reflected in natural language. So intuitions in different areas of philosophy may have linguistic intuitions. So intuitions about metaphysics, about epistemology, about philosophy of language, and about philosophy of mind. And one can even add philosophy of mathematics. And now, in those cases of intuitions that have a linguistic reflection, one can say linguistic intuitions serve to uncover philosophical intuitions. Now we can go on the next. So let me just give a few examples from different areas of philosophy. So if in epistemology, philosophers have appealed to linguistic data when they have discussed knowledge, so data surrounding the semantics of the verb know, but also epistemic modals like may and must, as well as verbs of appearance like seem and appear and look and taste. So there's quite a bit of philosophical literature that makes use of linguistic data surrounding these sorts of verbs. And then there's also some philosophical literature that makes not only use of these verbs, but also constructions in which those verbs may appear. So the distinction between knowledge how and knowledge that, for example, involves particular constructions involving different complementizers, how and that. So there's also philosophical literature that involves intuitions, linguistic intuitions that pertain to constructions involving different complementizers. Now, in philosophy of language, we have also some philosophical literature that appeals to linguistic data, though there's much less in that area, one can say. But let me just give some examples. So there's a recent article by Justin D'Ambrosio that argues that refer in English as a verb in English is in fact an intentional transitive verb, like lack or look for or search. And D'Ambrosio draws thinks that has actually significant philosophical consequences for the notion of reference, and undermines Chomsky's skepticism about reference, given that the verb refer itself isn't actually an extensional verb. So this is just an example. Another possible example, or let's say an example now from myself, is that mean in English is also not really an extensional verb that relates like two objects, and a verb and a thing that's a meaning, but rather it seems mean is takes, well, one can say in its first argument position, in the subject position, it takes as its argument quotations, pure quotations, and one can in fact also have something like the word rouge. But then in its object argument position, it takes just it's not referential, actually. So it only allows quotations. So one can't say rouge, or the word rouge means the concept or the meaning or whatever, red or of red. But can only say rouge means red, where red is a pure quotation. So mean in English is not an extensional transitive verb. And one may draw conclusions from that. Maybe English reflects some use theoretical notion of meaning or something of that sort. Yeah, and then I myself also have argued that the truth-maker semantics is in fact reflected in natural language itself, in particular in the constructions with a noun case. So in a paper in linguistics and philosophy, I argue that constructions with case are a reflection of the truth-making relation in the object language. So that would also be like an argument from natural language in favor of sort of the philosophical intuition that truth-making is important for the notion of content. Now, in philosophy of mind, there is quite a bit of literature that makes use of linguistic intuitions. So there's, of course, huge literature on attitude verbs that makes use of semantic linguistic intuitions about verbs like believe, intent, think, hope, and so on. And then the philosophical literature also pays considerable attention to grammatical constructions involving those verbs, namely clausal complementation. And in fact, the semantics and syntax of clausal complementation bears significantly on the nature of propositional attitudes, so the nature of a central notion in the philosophy of mind. And in fact, philosophers have appealed to different syntactic analyses of clausal complementation in order to argue for a particular notion of a propositional attitude as part of the philosophy of mind. Then another example is generic one. So I myself have argued that generic one reflects the notion of generic mental simulation. So that would be like evidence from natural language for like the philosophical intuition that there is such a thing as generic mental simulation. So linguistic intuitions are then used in order to uncover or sharpen philosophical intuitions. That is, philosophical intuitions about notions that are implicit in natural language. Now, linguistically reflected intuitions do not just consist in like a single content, a proposition, but rather they consist in various linguistic facts, including facts about constructional meaning. And in fact, nowadays, one will have to say if a philosopher makes appeal to linguistically to linguistic data in order to sharpen or to uncover a philosophical intuition, he or she would really have to make appeal to the entire range of relevant linguistic facts surrounding the phenomenon in question. So including grammatical facts, and in fact, including grammatical theories against which one can evaluate those linguistic data. Now, what is important is that one needs to distinguish notions that are implicit in natural language from philosophical notions that can be described upon reflection by using natural language, namely in an ordinary or ordinary way. So philosophers can, of course, use terms like knowledge, mental state, belief, perception, and so on in a particular, let's say, technical way. And various philosophers have also then argued that, well, their notion of knowledge, let's say, is not the one that's reflected in the verb know, or their notion of a mental state is not the one reflected in like the noun belief in English or something like that, but rather it's supposed to be a technical notion. And so so those philosophers, of course, use English as well. But now one cannot, of course, not appeal to that use of natural language in order to uncover or sharpen a philosophical intuition. So let's say, technical uses of natural language on the part of philosophers or even non-philosophers is that these uses are not part of the kind of linguistic data one can use in order to sharpen or uncover philosophical intuitions. And that's quite an important point that I want to make. And that relates to the core-periphery distinction that I think is really important, not just for ontology, natural language ontology, but for all philosophical domains that are in some way reflected in linguistic data. So one cannot appeal to all uses of natural language in order to uncover or sharpen philosophical intuitions that appear to have a linguistic reflection. And in fact, one can observe that when philosophers appeal to linguistic data, like throughout the history of philosophy, they were clearly aware that they need to avoid sort of technical uses of natural language by philosophers or even non-philosophers, and in fact, or certain parts of language. So maybe even the noun knowledge itself or the noun mental state itself isn't particularly suited for uncovering philosophical intuitions, but rather, in fact, one can observe that when philosophers want to appeal to natural language in order to sharpen intuitions about knowledge, they appeal to the verb to know. They do not appeal to the noun knowledge. And I think that that is a generalization that one can make, that verbs are used in order to uncover philosophical intuitions, but not generally nouns. And for like perception, philosophers wouldn't appeal to the noun perception in order to uncover what our intuitions about perception consists in, but rather they look at natural uses or ordinary uses of the verb to see. Yeah, now we can move a bit farther down. So a special domain that's implicit in natural language or reflected in natural language, that is in the core of natural language, is natural language ontology. So one can in fact say that the ontology, the subject matter of natural language ontology is the ontology that's implicit in natural language. And that is to be sharply distinguished from an ontology that can be described upon reflection, or maybe even not so much a reflection, by using natural language. So throughout the history of metaphysics, philosophers have appealed sometimes more than at other times to natural language in order to sharpen intuition. So one can say Aristotle even did that. Certainly medieval metaphysicians did that very explicitly. So they appeal to particular classes of expressions or constructions in order to uncover philosophical intuitions, in order to argue for particular philosophical notions. Let's say that universals are immanent rather than, or something like this, yeah. So in that sense, natural language ontology has been a practice throughout the history of philosophy. But of course, today it's also an emerging discipline that is both part of linguistics and philosophy. Now we can see some quickly some examples of philosophers that have appealed to natural language in order to uncover metaphysical intuitions. So the first example is from Kit Fine. So he argued that an object like a statue should not be identified with the material from which it is made, even though the two may be spatio-temporally coincident. So he looked at various predicates and observed that predicates may have different readings or degrees of acceptability with like the statue and the clay. So the statue is impressive means something different from the clay is impressive. If the statue is new, it doesn't mean that the clay is new, and so on. And then also the two have different existence conditions, which can be brought out by applying the predicate exists. So this is an example where a philosopher appealed to natural language, particular kinds of predicates, in order to argue for the ontological distinction between the statue and the clay from which it was made. Another example from the same philosopher is the distinction between events and material objects. So some philosophers have argued that events and material objects should just be both viewed as sort of space-time worms. Now, other philosophers like Kit Fine have argued that the two differ with respect to certain sorts of predicates. In particular, events go with different existence predicates than material objects. Material objects go with exist, events with happen, occur, or take place. And then they also behave differently with respect to modifiers of these existence predicates. So that's a good argument for a distinction, ontological distinction between events and material objects. And of course, then one has to given a semantics of these predicates and explain why they behave differently with the two sorts of entities. Then another example is from a bit farther down, from Zeno Wendler. So Wendler is a philosopher that systematically appealed to natural language in order to argue for metaphysical distinctions. So, for example, he argued for the distinction between events and facts, again on the basis of different sorts of predicates that have different readings or degrees of acceptability with events and facts, respectively. Then another philosopher that's less known is Kazimierz Twardowski, who argued for a distinction between like a promise and an act of promising. For him, the promise was a product, the act of promising an act. And he argued that there are different predicates applying or predicates display different readings or degrees of acceptability with the two things, products and actions. So a promise can be fulfilled, for example, but an act of promising can hardly be said to be fulfilled. So that was taken by him to be indicative of, one can say, an ontological distinction. I adopted generalizations of that sort as well, and I explicitly argue that there is really an ontological distinction. Now, linguists have long posited sort of model structures that consist in different types of entities and relations among them as far as they are sort of grammatically reflected. But linguists tend to take an agnostic, or at least have tended to take an agnostic attitude as regards the elements in such models. So one finds that in Bach and then later in Fiorin and Del Fitto. And then there is little connection to, well, if you take such an agnostic attitude, there's no longer a connection to what philosophers have done when they argued for metaphysical notion or theory appealing to natural language. So I think one should view natural language ontology really not just as a part of linguistics, but as a subdiscipline of both metaphysics and linguistics. So it's part of descriptive metaphysics that gives priority to intuitions that are linguistically reflected, let's say. And then one, of course, has to deal with the results of that research to make sense of that ontology that's reflected in natural language or that corresponds to linguistically reflected intuitions. But here, the linguists and the philosophers would be in the same boat. Now, if one takes ontology to really be to an extent revealed by natural language, or really ontology, or at least there is an ontology that's reflected in natural language. And now this means that the intuitions about that ontology are really supported by linguistic intuitions. And in some sense, there's no longer a reason to distinguish the two. In fact, when one looks at the linguistic practice of like construing models or setting up models in a certain way, they just had an agnostic attitude. So we don't want to say what the ontological status of the things in those models are. But still, the models are strictly motivated by linguistic intuitions. And so I think the ontological intuitions that are driven by those linguistic data then should just be, in fact, coincide with linguistic intuitions. They are another side of the same coin, so to speak. And so one would have the view then that there are at least some philosophical intuitions that are at the same time linguistic intuitions. Now here one may encounter a worry from philosophers in that like intuitions here, one second, about so intuitions of natural language ontology seem to have a really different status from linguistic intuitions. So linguistic intuitions, at least given their generative background, are sort of caused by our language faculty. So they reflect between what they represent and it appears that is not the case with ontological intuitions. So ontological intuitions, it seems, can misrepresent ontology. So that cannot be excluded as such. So a common view, of course, in philosophy is that natural language is not a guide to ontology. So what should one make with that? What should one do with such a general objection? Well, I think one has to be careful when appealing to reality. So it's not so obvious that what reality itself should be viewed as. And in fact, there are recent views about reality according to which reality is shaped by our linguistic access to it. So there's a recent project by Richard Gaskin who argued that reality is throughout shaped by our linguistic access to it. And if that is so, then one might say, well, maybe there are different ontologies that are shaped by different kinds of linguistic access that we have to reality. But intuitions, ontological intuitions, are therefore almost by nature won't completely fail to capture what they mean to represent. So I think the view one would naturally then take is that there are just different ontologies that we that correspond to different maybe languages we make use of in order to access reality, or maybe theories that go along with different languages that we use. So yeah,
you have 10 minutes to finish.
Okay, yeah, good. So I move on. Yeah, so now I just have a summary that what needs to really be taken seriously by a philosopher today that appeals to natural language. So not just a few sentences, but one would have to make use of the full range of linguistic data that is today available, given the development of theoretical linguistics. Now I want to move to the core-periphery distinction. So section 4, so down. Yeah, so I already said not all linguistic data can be used in order to uncover philosophical intuitions, and in order to uncover the ontology, for example, that's implicit in natural language, or the epistemology, or the philosophy of mind, or the philosophy of language that is implicit in natural language. So we can move farther down now. So one thing that should be excluded is, of course, metaphysical assertions or philosophical assertions in general. So events are distinct from objects. That wouldn't be taken as a datum in order to argue for the distinction between events and material objects, for example. One might say that folk metaphysics does take metaphysical assertions, or may take metaphysical assertions seriously, but folk metaphysics needs to be distinguished from the ontology that's implicit in natural language. And there are various areas, it seems, where there are in fact divergencies. So unrestricted sum formation arguably obtains for the ontology implicit in natural language, but clearly not for folk metaphysics. Now concerning the distinction between core and periphery. So the observation that I already mentioned is that philosophers generally avoid linguistic data from the periphery. So the periphery includes, of course, technical notions like Heidegger's the nothing or to nothing, and then notions then terms like essence, ontological dependence, and so on. So we cannot uncover philosophical intuitions appealing to the use of those parts of natural language. And then even just philosophical uses of ordinary part of non-technical parts of language, like property, object, group, cannot be used in order to uncover philosophical intuitions. Then it seems all reifying terms, like in 14, cannot be used for that purpose. And in fact, they are never used for that purpose. Now, farther down on the handout, I just give some examples that indicate that those reifying terms are systematically avoided in the philosophical literature that appeals otherwise to linguistic data. So Frege doesn't use the truth value true when arguing for truth values being objects, and so on. So I don't need to go through that. So even Davidson doesn't argue for events on the basis of the noun event, or even just nominalizations, but rather he thought that events are best, like the ontology of events is in fact best reflected in verbs. So philosophers and semanticists, in fact, make tacit have always made tacit use of a distinction between core and periphery of language. Now we can go further down. So only the core, not the periphery, reflects philosophical domains that are implicit in natural language. That doesn't just hold for ontology. So now one should ask the question, well, what kind of contrast is involved in the core and the periphery? So intuitively, it seems periphery involves like a reflective use of language. And that's exactly what one doesn't want to make use of when uncovering intuitions. Whereas core involves a use of language that goes along with implicit sort of acceptance. And now that distinction is to be distinguished from like a distinction in the nature of the philosophical notions or the ontology itself. So one may arrive at an ontological notion through reflection or by implicit acceptance. It may still be the same notion. So the core, the philosophical domain that's implicit in natural language is one that involves implicit acceptance, and it's reflected only in the core of language. Now we can move further down on page 9. So reifying terms, it seems, always belong to the periphery. What about the rest of language? So one might naturally think that there's the lexical functional divide that plays a role. So the functional part of grammar is always core, whereas the lexical part, it seems, is can be used at least in a peripheral kind of way. But that doesn't seem to be quite correct if one recalls what I had already mentioned, namely that verbs seem to generally be part of the core. So philosophers generally look at verbs when they are interested in propositional attitudes or whatever kind of notion, even existence. Philosophers look at the verb exist rather than at the noun. So the distinction between, can we go farther down? Between verbs and nouns is an important one. So, for example, exist as a verb can not be applied to events. But one can talk about the noun, like without an argument, one can use the verb, one can use the noun existence without an argument to cover like the mode of being of everything there is. So the noun can easily be used in a way that is not restricted like the verb is. So nouns, it seems, can generally be used in a non-ordinary philosophical way, but not verbs. So even a philosopher that's convinced about the universality of existence is unable to say 17a or 17b. So even Anbing von Inwagen can't use those sentences appropriately. Can we go farther down now? Yeah, so in 18, I have given some examples where existence is clearly used in a way that would cover all modes of being. Now, as soon as we have an argument, like in 19, we again have a restriction, the existence of the rain. That no longer is any good. So this is a really interesting phenomenon. Why verbs, it seems, belong to the core, but nouns can always be used in a non-ordinary way. Another example is the noun property. So one can use the noun property to mean abundant property or natural property, whatever notion of property as a philosopher or non-philosopher may have in mind. But when you use property in construction, like the property of being happy, suddenly there's a restriction that you cannot overcome, even if you're a philosopher that has a particular notion of property in mind. So the restriction, for example, is that you can't say the property of walking or talking or sleeping. Now, even if you're a philosopher that thinks that properties are just contents of predicates, you cannot use that construction. But you can use the noun property, meaning that notion of a property. So this is the phenomenon is then that the philosophical notions that are sort of associated with the core of language, like with verbs, they are really obligatory. So when you use the language, the core of language, or if you use the language in a non-peripheral way, then you have to commit yourself to these notions, like a non-univocal notion of existence or a particular notion of a property. You can't avoid that. There's no way of revising that ontology using natural language. So it is automatic when you use natural language to accept those notions. And that indicates that the acceptance, it's actually not really acceptance of that notion, of those notions, but rather it's something like using the language itself. So using language means you use those philosophical notions. And so those notions are not something you accept, but rather they are really just part of the language. They are part of the, if you want to call it, knowledge of the language, or let's say they're just part of the possession of language. And so that then means that philosophical intuitions, like the non-univocality of existence or a particular notion of a property that's reflected in the noun property when it's in construction, these intuitions are entirely on a par with linguistic intuitions. So it's just like knowledge of language. There's nothing belief-like about those intuitions. So that's it.
Thank you so much. So if you have questions for Frederick, please just raise your hand. Peter?
Yeah, thanks for that, Friederike. It seems like you've been on a roll lately. You've been churning out a lot of really interesting stuff in this area, and I think I guess it won't surprise you to hear that I'm very interested in this project. One of the things that I'm curious about, though, is about the nature of intuitions themselves. And here I'm thinking about recent work by Timothy Williamson, in which he's suggested that, maybe we shouldn't even use the word intuition because it suggests a certain kind of Cartesian certainty that comes with it. And maybe it's better to use a word judgment. So the way he wants to talk is like every time in philosophy, someone uses the term intuition, they should really just say judgment, right? And you could do this in linguistics too, obviously. So, and I've started doing it myself. So instead of saying, well, I have the intuition that this is acceptable, or this is bound, or this has a certain scope reading, I'll say I judge that this is the case. So this then is a question about how you're thinking about intuitions. do you feel this difference between an intuition and a judgment? If you do you have some reason to prefer intuitions to judgments, or are you neutral on this?
Yeah, so I would not want to use judgment, because judgment is something that you can arrive at from reflection, and that's precisely what should not happen here. And I take intuitions to be really more on a par with perception. And even like in a perceptual state, you may have to make some effort to be sure about what you about the nature of that state or so. Yeah, so I do. I would
That's
not want
okay.
to
That's
use it. Yeah.
that's fair enough. So suppose I say then, okay, what about a certain unreflective judgment? So like, say
Hmm.
I'm doing chemistry and I'm reading the meniscus of a fluid in a test tube or a graduated cylinder, and I say I don't intuit that the meniscus is here. I judge that it is. Okay, so then you might say, well, okay, yeah, fair enough. This shouldn't be reflective, but it is still a judgment, an unreflective judgment. How about that?
Well, that sounds too much like a quick and easy intuition. So I'm sort of with Bengtson on this, that intuitions may have to be uncovered with quite a bit of work. So through carefully set up thought experiments, or like an unreflective judgment isn't really something you uncover with effort. And also linguistic intuitions, um, like we linguists know that we often have to really do some effort in order to sharpen our own intuitions about something.
Then do you think of the intuitions as being like controlled experiments where you have to learn how to filter out, say, pragmatic information and so forth? Or processing, you know how linguists do. Well, I got to filter out the processing or filter out certain pragmatics thing. And you could think of
Yeah,
that as being like a control and an experiment. I mean, are you sympathetic with that?
yeah, if you like, yeah,
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
yeah. I mean, they might be on a par with what Martina mentioned the other day. So that like your knowledge is sort of my kind of intuition, and intuitions don't have to be factive, and that's what you seem to want as well.
Martina?
Yeah, thank you. It was really fun seeing this discussed. I have two questions, comments. Like one, I'm still a little confused with the analogy between the core and the periphery. Like I don't quite see the analogy between the linguistic notion of core and periphery and what you have in mind here. And I'm wondering whether do you have in mind like the use of language versus the meta use of the language for those terms? Is that what, like I still don't get it. Well, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, you can just say philosophical non-ordinary uses of language.
Right. Okay.
So in ordinary language philosophy, philosophers had argued that non-ordinary uses of language on the part of philosophers actually lead to philosophical problems,
Okay.
whereas
I
they try to.
Right.
So it's sort of that same distinction.
Okay. Okay.
And
And
then
then
it's really an observation that philosophers, when they appeal to natural language in support of a philosophical notion or view, systematically avoid certain uses of language or parts of language, like reifying terms, let's say, or like technical uses of familiar terms.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the other question that arose is like whether you think what you're saying here, this equating philosophical intuitions with linguistic intuitions, whether that has something to say about the different conceptualization of, say, what Wolfram Hintze calls the uncartesian view. So either there is thought and then there is language, and language is used to express thought. That's the Cartesian view. His view, the un-Cartesian view, is that you can't distinguish the two. Like, you know, the thought is a linguistically constructed notion. And I'm wondering whether this equating the intuitions is in the un-Cartesian spirit.
That you don't make a distinction between thought and language.
Right.
Yeah, in a way, it goes even farther in that, I mean, I might not even distinguish reality from.
Exactly.
Yeah. Given this, I mean, I'm just starting to digest this linguistic idealist view, but that sheds a very interesting perspective on, language from a generative point of view. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yuan?
Oh, hi. Yeah, I was interested in the difference between linguistic intuition and, as well, non-linguistic ontological intuition. And so it seems to me that you can have ontological intuitions that seem to be unquestionable until you're, as it were, pushed in the right direction. So, you know, I take the history of science to be full of these things. So, for instance, you know, if you think about discussions of motion and inertia in the 17th century, I assume that nobody really, before Galileo, thought that there wasn't really a distinction between being at rest and being in uniform motion. And it turns out, given the right kind of examples, being pushed in the right direction, then you realize, oh, gee, yes, there really isn't a difference between being at rest and being in uniform motion. This is this kind of relative difference. So in other words, this is to say, it seems in the ontological case that your intuitions can, as well, go wrong, you know, relative to the way the world is, but in ways that you might not be able to kind of figure out. Whereas in the if that's acceptable to you, do you want to say that something similar would happen in the linguistic case? That one's linguistic intuitions are, as it were, fallible in a certain way relative to what we might discover about the nature of a language?
No, I mean, if one is fully competent in a language, then one's intuitions shouldn't be fallible. I mean, about ontological intuitions, so I have the impression it's more a matter of accounting for like the ontology in the right way. So it may be a mind-dependent perspectival ontology or so. So I do not find it so dramatic if for particular purposes one wouldn't want to adopt that ontology, but I think one should can just make sense of it as something perspectival, as something mind dependent, and it's of course not useful for all purposes, but yeah.
But I mean,
so one would need to distinguish an ontology for the periphery from an ontology for the core, and they may very well diverge. And there might be one might argue that the ontology of the periphery is the correct one or so, but I mean I have a permissive attitude toward ontology, so for me there's no problem having various ontologies for different purposes. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Julie?
Yes, hi, Friederike. Thank you. It's really interesting, and I really liked the distinction between core and periphery that was revealing and intuitive. What I want to ask you is, are we talking about linguistic intuitions just because we are doing language, and in principle, the same argument applies to any representational system? which, like for any representational system, we will be limited to those distinctions that this representational system can make and cannot go beyond it. You mentioned mathematics at some point, but you didn't go kind of this direction.
I mean, that is really interesting. I mean, I have the intuition, the feeling that natural language is special in that it does allow for non-ordinary use, and that in itself is really interesting. But it's also really interesting that parts of natural language strictly resist such use. Yeah, and yeah, I don't quite see how pragmatic comes in, but
well, I mean that language, the restrictions that we have, that we cannot get beyond the linguistic ontology into a, let's say, metaphysical ontology, is that language is a representational system, right? It allows us to make only those distinctions that we have in the system, and those distinctions are limited, and we cannot go beyond. And that's true for any representational system. Do you mean what I mean?
So in natural language, you can go beyond. Maybe I'm not quite seen. I don't know. I was thinking about sign language or animal language or something.
I think about mathematics, about visual systems, about hearing, about any other, and I mean not experiences, but about any other systems that we impose on the even mathematical systems that other sciences use. They impose this representation on the reality, like chemistry, and then they can solve. They cannot see beyond the representational system. That's what I had in mind.
Yeah. At the moment, I don't see how those other representational systems would allow for non-ordinary uses. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a distinction. True. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, it seems that there are no more questions. Martina.
Yeah, just one quick question. I find the observation about nouns and verbs fascinating, and I'm wondering whether it is a fact about English, or what, like, if some I used to work on a language that arguably didn't have a noun-verb distinction, at least not at the root level, and I wonder whether it's called Comelum Salish, and I wonder whether if one was a philosopher in that language, whether one, a similar generalization would arise or not. So that's. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I understand in those languages, so you can use roots in a noun kind of way or in a verb kind of way, and
exactly.
I expect the noun kind of way to permit.
I see.
But it's like nouns without construction, so without internal argument, without a close opposition construction or so. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Good. Cool. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Friederike, again for your talk. It was very interesting.
Thank you for your questions.